of JNS, and it is a privilege and honor to be sitting here with Colonel Richard Kemp, who has led forces both in Iraq, Afghanistan, and elsewhere. Richard Kemp, welcome to JNS.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So you've served and led combat battalions in Iraq and Afghanistan, and what does that experience tell you about what the IDF is facing inside of Gaza, which is a very difficult urban fighting environment?
Yeah, there's lots of similarities between the British and American and other Western forces fighting in Afghanistan and Iraq and what the IDF is doing in Gaza today. And the similarities predominantly flow from the enemy, the way the enemy operates, because of course military forces have to act in accordance with what the enemy is doing. And in this case, the enemy, as in Afghanistan and Iraq, melting into the civilian population. They're not wearing uniforms. They're difficult to identify. They're using human shields. They're using mosques, hospitals, schools, other protected locations to fight from. And that's exactly very similar to the situation in Afghanistan and Iraq, and it to an extent dictates the tactics you can use against them. And that includes obviously the measures you need to take to kill as many of the enemy as you can, destroy their equipment and their weapons, but minimize the death of civilians who are being used as human shields or civilians who are in the area. I think one of the major differences between theaters like Afghanistan and Iraq is that Gaza is a very small area, a very tiny, compact area on which the IDF has a huge amount of intelligence. They have probably the best intelligence coverage of that area of any conflict zone in the world that's ever occurred, I suspect. That may sound a little bit contradictory when you look at the intelligence failures of 7th of October, but I think they were more strategic failures rather than tactical low-level intelligence. And the IDF has really got the whole Gaza Strip covered. That doesn't mean to say they know where every single person is and what they're doing, because the enemy moves, the enemy changes, etc. But that's one major difference. Another one is that in the case of Afghanistan in particular, Iraq as well, but in Afghanistan they had the enemy had places to take refuge. In other words, Pakistan and Iran predominantly, where they could go reconstitute themselves, rearm themselves, and come back into battle, and we couldn't go in and fight them there, with the exception of drone strikes in Pakistan. So that's a big difference. And I think the third difference, which is maybe even more significant than either of those two, is that Israel is fighting this war on its doorstep. Afghanistan, Iraq, other theaters we fought in, thousands of miles from home. And although we fought there to defend our own civilian populations, it was kind of indirectly, whereas this is absolutely direct. We saw what happened on the 7th of October. That gave a graphic impression of why the IDF need to do this. And so I think that, if nothing else, that kind of motivates soldiers beyond the level of motivation that you would probably get in other theaters of war where the enemy is not hammering on your door.
Right. I think a couple of the other differences that we see are the intense microscope that is on Israeli conduct inside the Gaza Strip by the international media, by the international community. Probably you had a greater degree of latitude, or at least what you were doing from one day to the next might not have been reported as comprehensively as you see the reporting happening from the Gaza Strip. What impact does that play, that large media microscope, on the IDF's actions?
I think when we fight, we are scrutinized by the media in similar sort of way to the IDF is scrutinized, but there is a big difference. I think there's much more intense interest in what's happening in Israel from around the world. And secondly, there's a kind of inbuilt anti-Israel bias into so much of the media, which doesn't really exist in the case of British or American forces that are fighting. If shall we say, the benefit of the doubt is given, the assumption that the forces are doing as best they can, and yes, they will cause civilian casualties, but it's unfortunate, incidental. They didn't do it deliberately. This is the kind of approach given to other troops, whereas with Israel, the assumption automatically is that they've deliberately killed innocent civilians, and that they're going out to massacre civilians. And of course, that is totally and utterly wrong. It's the opposite of the truth. But the media have this decades-old anti-Israel narrative, which they have to drive home all the time, even to the extent where you have an incident in the Al-Ali hospital, for example, where a few weeks ago, where what happened wasn't clear by any means, but immediately the media accused Israel of doing it, immediately, without any consideration. And if you take another war that's going on right now in Ukraine, I was in Ukraine a few weeks ago myself, and the situation's not totally dissimilar. Russia invades Ukraine, Ukraine fights back against Russia. Hamas invades Israel, Israel fights back against Hamas. And of course, the two things, Hamas and Russia, are directly connected as well. They have close relations, as does the hand behind the Hamas war and Iran and Russia as well. But you don't get, there are situations, there are confused situations in the Ukraine war where, let's say, a power station or a school or something is hit by a rocket. The automatic assumption is not that this is Ukraine that's done it, and Ukraine has done it deliberately. There's nothing like that, and that has a major impact. And the strategic impact it has is on international pressure against Israel, driven by this agenda, by the lies and the distortions. International pressure against Israel to restrain itself more, and to even go as far as ceasefire is concerned. And that I think is a very dangerous situation for Israel to be in.
Yeah, we saw that there was international pressure before the launch of the ground operation to delay. We're starting to hear in the international media that perhaps the timetable for Israeli action is starting to close from this international pressure. And there's also calls for these humanitarian pauses, which are now a few hours a day, to allow Gazan civilians to move south towards safer pasture, but even for longer. Humanitarian pauses, potentially in the realm of some kind of a hostage negotiation. How does Israel, on the one hand, deal with the international pressure, on the other hand, tackle its objectives, which are to dismantle Hamas, get back its hostages, and also to move in a methodical and effective manner that doesn't harm the Israeli soldier as they're going on to tackle their missions?
You make a very good point. That last point you made is something that people very often forget, which is that an Israeli soldier's life counts. An Israeli soldier's life is no less valuable than the life of a civilian in Gaza, and that's very often forgotten about. And it's extremely important that the IDF operate in a way that minimizes their own casualties. And it's not just for the value of life and humanitarian reasons. It's also they need to have as many troops as they can still fighting to destroy this enemy. So that's extremely important. But when it comes to there are sort of two conflicting dynamics here, really. One is doing it with speed, with great speed, destroying Hamas as quickly as possible to get ahead of international pressure. Maybe you could say we've got a matter of days or weeks before pressure begins to build up, and therefore you have to speed up operations. Well, of course, not only does that result in probably more Israeli soldiers getting killed by speeding up unduly, but also in more civilians getting killed as well. So it's it's counterproductive in many ways. On the other hand, you could do it slowly and methodically, and civilians are still going to die because of the way Hamas operates, and the pressure builds up. So I think the important thing is for the Israeli government to allow the IDF to fight at the pace it needs to fight at, according to the plans laid down and the directions of the generals. That is the priority beyond anything else. And at the same time, explain what's happening not so much to the, I mean, to explain to the world is important, and I think the IDF is doing a pretty good job at that, albeit in the face of disbelief and anti-Israel bias that we've spoken about before. But particularly, I think, to make clear to Israel's allies, and in particular the United States, exactly what's happening and why it's happening, in order that they can understand, and in order that they don't succumb to public pressure to try and get Israel to stop fighting. Because when we come to ceasefires, what we're talking about in a ceasefire, it sounds great. Let's have a ceasefire. Everyone stops killing everyone. Fine. But what that means, that doesn't mean that Hamas is going to throw down their weapons. They're going to just do nothing. They're going to have negotiations. It doesn't mean that at all. It means that Israel is going to withdraw back behind the borders. Hamas is going to reconstitute. It's going to rearm itself. It's going to get ready to carry out more attacks, rocket attacks, and try and carry out more attacks, such as it carried out on the 7th of October, which its leaders have made only too clear it's determined to do so. And I believe them when they say that. This is not rhetoric. They must be taken seriously. So that's the outcome of a ceasefire. Whether it's a short ceasefire or a ceasefire that develops over longer term, it's dangerous for the IDF. The IDF have to deal with this situation now. The only caveat I'd put on that is that it's very important to get those hostages back. And if there is a possibility assessed by Israel, not assessed by anybody else, but assessed by Israel as being a possibility to get a likelihood, shall we say, of getting a large number or all of the hostages back, then Israel perhaps should contemplate some kind of pause in order to allow that to happen. But short of that, in my view, Israel should not stop fighting until and unless Hamas lays down its weapons and surrenders, or until they're all destroyed.
Right. Obviously, getting these hostages back is one of the primary concerns. Where does that fall, in terms of the military objective? Because on the one hand, you have a limited timetable. You need to dismantle Hamas. You need to get them to lay down their arms. You need to confiscate their arms. You need to destroy the tunnels. And you have a limited time frame to do that. On the other hand, you have these hostages, and you see that Hamas from the outset took the hostages as part of this psychological warfare tactic against the state of Israel, against the international community, specifically to use them as leverage to get Israel to pause or to stop the fighting. So how do they use that against Israel, and how does Israel calculate whether it should pause to get the hostages or to move forward because of this international pressure dynamic?
It's probably the toughest question in the whole war for the government of Israel and the IDF, because getting those hostages back is an immense challenge. No matter how far the IDF progress into Gaza, actually getting 240 plus hostages back is incredibly difficult. I was involved myself in hostage rescue operations in Afghanistan and Iraq with British citizens captured in both those places, and that involved 1s, 2s, and 3s in separate incidents. So it was nothing like the scale of what we've got now, and that in itself, even just dealing with a very small number of hostages, was phenomenally difficult in the context of a bigger conflict which was going on at the time.
And also with these tunnels, we imagine that the hostages are not all in 1, 2, or 3 different rooms, but probably spread out across the entire Gaza Strip.
Probably spread out across the Gaza Strip, probably kept in locations that are particularly secure, that are very difficult to attack, that are probably rigged with explosives, booby traps, and with a gun to the head of the hostages, so that if the captors decide that or feel that the IDF is about to carry out a rescue operation, they can shoot the hostages. So that whole equation makes it very, very difficult. And in terms of the priorities, this is the toughest issue, I think. The chances of Hamas releasing those hostages out of the goodness of their hearts is about 0 or less than 0. So they're only going to do it if let's say, if Israel agrees to stop attacking, I think, is my opinion. And that obviously is, and even then, if that does occur, there's no guarantee they're going to release the hostages, because you can't obviously take anything that Hamas says at their word. So that leaves you in a quandary. And I think in my perspective, and it's a horrible thing to say, the IDF's priority have to be destroying Hamas. Second priority, very high level, is rescuing the hostages. But destroying Hamas and protecting the whole of the nation of Israel, all of the citizens of Israel, is a higher priority in my view.
From somebody who's watching this conflict as an observer, but having yourself a significant battle experience, what can you tell us about the way the IDF has conducted its battle plans, working from the north toward the south, encapsulating Gaza City, collaborating between ground forces, naval forces, and the air? How is it going in your view so far?
From what I can see of it, from the outside, of course, it seems to be going extremely well. And, there was a lot of criticism and impatience early on when, straight after 7th of October, when the air campaign began, about a 3-week air campaign, which people were saying, well, why aren't they getting on the ground? Why aren't they getting on the ground? And I think a lot of that impatience came from the media, who wanted to be filming something, weren't really interested in didn't understand military operations, but just wanted something to happen. But I think the IDF plan was absolutely right to spend 3 weeks doing a number of things. Firstly, carrying out significant attrition against the Hamas terrorists in Gaza and the other terrorists, and weakening them as much as it possibly could, destroying as much as they could from the air, so that when the troops go in on the ground, there's less of an enemy to face. And I think that was very effective. It's an obvious thing to do. It's what we did, for example, in the first Gulf War before we went into Iraq. We spent several months softening up the enemy with air campaign. So that was the right thing to do. Secondly, to gain intelligence on, obviously, the dispositions of the enemy, their reactions, where they were going, what they were doing, and on the hostages, where the hostages were located. So that 3-week period was a critical period for that. And finally, Israel mobilized something like 360,000 reservists, which is incredibly impressive in any time frame, but nevertheless the very short time frame that Israel took. But you get those reservists into the bases, then you've got to equip them, you've got to clothe them, you've got to train them, refresh their training, and all of that takes time. So all of these things can happen as the initial air campaign is unfolding. And then Israel went in on the ground. I think they went in very hard. I carried out a few preliminary raids to identify enemy positions and to soften up certain enemy places, and rescued one of the hostages. And then they went in hard, and I think they encircled Gaza City very, very quickly, and are now working on dealing with Gaza City, getting as many of the civilians as remained there, getting them out of the way as quickly as they could, destroying as much of Hamas as possible, and closing in on the Hamas command centers and their main positions under the various hospitals inside Gaza. So I think that was broadly what happened, and it seems to me, from what I can work out, to have gone quickly, even quicker than perhaps the IDF commanders expected, more effectively and critically, I would say, although there have been some terrible casualties in the IDF, but much fewer, I think, than you might imagine would have occurred.
How important from a military perspective is it to get the civilians out of the way?
It's extremely important because, of course, the military, all they want to do is kill the terrorists and destroy their equipment. That's what they want to do. They don't want to harm civilians, and that applies whether they're the IDF, whether they're British Army, the US Army, or any other army. That is a very high priority for them. So if the civilians aren't there, then you can do your job. If the civilians are there, it makes doing the job of killing the enemy much more difficult. It doesn't mean to say you can't kill the enemy if there are civilians around, and as providing you adhere to the laws of war, which require you to warn people to go, require you to discriminate between a civilian and a military target, and only attack the military target. As long as you do that, which the IDF do rigorously, and providing you employ the principle of proportionality, which means that if there is a risk of civilian deaths or wounding, then you should only carry out an attack if the military benefit of doing that exceeds the likely number of civilian casualties. It's not an exact science. It's something that a commander has to decide for himself, sometimes in a matter of seconds.
Right. And over again, if there are civilians in the area. So getting the civilians out of the area alleviates the need to be taking those types of second-by-second battle decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, that's why Hamas do everything they can to keep civilians in the area. And they force civilians often at gunpoint to stay, because what they want, of course, is not, they don't just want these civilians to protect their fighters. They want the IDF to kill their civilians. That's their main objective, is that the IDF should kill as many civilians as possible, so that international pressure builds up on Israel to stop attacking them.
It seems like it's taken several weeks, but finally civilians of Gaza have gotten the hint that the fighting is intense and that they should move to the south. And even in the last week or so, the IDF has been, opening up these humanitarian corridors, protecting them, even while under fire, in order to allow the Gazan civilians to move south. This seems to have been a very beneficial move, even though I think there's a lot of people in Israel that are saying, why are you taking these steps? But now you have most of northern Gaza civilians down in the south, and Israel is operating in the north, in an area where there's many less civilians. At some point, assuming that the operations go well inside Gaza City, then the IDF's going to have to start to move south. Gaza's not that big, and now you have all the residents that were in the north and the south as well. So what challenges does having all of Gazan civilians down in the south pose to the IDF? Because there's not really too much place for them to go.
Yeah, that's the really big challenge. And of course, the expectation, I think, is that, or the hope, shall we say, is that, and that the knowledge that the main center of the Hamas terrorist network is in the north. That's the main. But of course, many of them have tried to get away, to get south, and will no doubt continue to do so, and some have succeeded. So there will be Hamas terrorists down there in the south as well, and they have to be dealt with. I think the hope will be that Israel will strangle the main brain and heart of Hamas in the north, which will then cause Hamas as an organization to collapse. And perhaps that, in fear of Israel carrying out attacks in the south, the people there will maybe restrain Hamas themselves from carrying out attacks from there. So I think that, but it's probably going to be the next toughest challenge for the IDF to face.
You talked about when you were fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan that the terrorists had place to go, and you weren't able to fight there. Here in Gaza, the terrorists can go underground into the tunnels, but in addition to having the terrorists have a place to go, civilians also would have a place to go. And here in this case, because of the nature of the Gaza Strip and it having only a small border with Egypt that doesn't want any Gazans to pour across the border, Gazans don't have a place to go. We just saw this morning there was an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal written by Danny Danon, who was Israel's former ambassador to the United Nations, and also Ram Ben Barak, who was a former deputy director of the Mossad. The two of these, from opposite sides of the political spectrum, both suggesting that the border needs to get open and that those who wish to leave the war zone should be allowed to do so. Can you talk a little bit about this refugee issue and whether or not this border should get open?
Well, I think that obviously is something that only Egypt can decide. It would be ideal if Egypt would allow the refugees to get away, if they wanted to get out of the southern part of Gaza into Egypt, but Egypt doesn't want them. And I think that's a bit of a deadlock. Unless the international community can apply pressure on Egypt to allow that, then it's you end up in a situation where all these civilians are stuck in southern Gaza, and Israel will probably have to at some point address the military threat from southern Gaza. So it's going to be tough. But I can't see a resolution unless Egypt changes its mind.
Well, we could understand why Egypt wouldn't want to absorb all of the Gazan refugees, but you come from the United Kingdom, and we've certainly seen how in the last several years, decade plus, that Europe has absorbed numerous refugees, millions of refugees from the civil war in Syria just to Israel's north. We've seen hundreds of thousands, if not more, refugees from the Ukraine crisis be resettled. What lead should the international community be taking in trying to address the refugee crisis in Gaza?
Well, I think the international community should be pressuring Arab countries to take Arab refugees. We have plenty of refugees from, as you mentioned, from Ukraine, from Afghanistan, from other countries in our own country and in other European countries. This is a problem that should be handled, in my view, by the Arabs. These are Arab people. If they need to take refuge outside of Gaza, then it should be the Arab countries, the neighboring Arab countries that take them. But we know that that's not on the cards.
What does that say about the Arab countries, both in their view of Palestinians, and also what does it say about the Palestinians that their Arab brethren don't want to take them in?
Well, it tells you everything you need to know. I think it's, I believe that the Arab and the Arab countries foresaw what was going to happen. They foresaw this, and it horrified them. But I think despite what they say on the surface, despite their condemnation of Israel in some cases, most of the Arab countries, and I've spoken to people in a number of different Arab countries since this conflict began, most of them want Israel to deal with this situation quickly and as effectively as possible. They want Hamas out of the way because they recognize the dangers and the threats that Hamas and potentially a huge number of Palestinian refugees pose to their own countries.
We saw that the United States at the very beginning of the conflict sent over 2 USS carrier groups, a tremendous amount of firepower to the region, primarily as an attempt to prevent Hezbollah, which is an even larger Iranian terror proxy to Israel's north and southern Lebanon, from entering the war, and also to Iran and its other proxies to stay out of the war. Number one, has this deployment been a solid deterrent against Hezbollah and Iran? And two, what does it say about the United States and the international community's support for Israel in its military objectives to take out Hamas?
I think the one of the carrier strike groups was specifically designed to threaten Hezbollah and to deter Hezbollah from launching a major attack. The other carrier strike group was focused more on Iran, to deter Iran from getting actively involved or indeed directing Hezbollah to carry out an attack. So those deterrents to some extent have worked, but we have seen I would say an intense level of attack from Hezbollah in the north, with quite a lot of Israelis killed as a consequence. Missile attacks, anti-tank gun attacks, attempted drone attacks from Lebanon into Israel. So yes, it's been effective it hasn't seen a massive barrage unleashed. And we have seen hesitation, I think, in Nasrallah's speeches that he's made since the war began, which suggest a degree of intimidation. But that problem still is there, and it still has to be addressed. It's got to be dealt with at some point, and I think sooner rather than later by Israel. But in answer to the second part of your question about international support, I think this is a rare situation. I don't think we've seen such strong support from the United States, or indeed from countries like the UK and other European countries, to support Israel in a time of war. And I think that stems from the realization of two things. One, of the real horror that occurred on the 7th of October, which is unimaginable. And I don't think any other country in the world has been subjected to such an intensive and awful terrorist attack. And I include 9/11 in that, because if you look at the population ratios, 7th of October is something like 15 or 20 9/11s in one go.
Also, there was 19 terrorists involved in the September 11th attack, and here we saw close to 3,000 come across Israel's border to perpetrate this attack.
Right. So a massive kind of step up in in the intensity of a terrorist attack. And I think that's the need to deal with that is recognized by Israel's allies. And secondly, I think the hand of Iran is understood. The threat that Iran poses to the region, to Israel, but also to the whole region and indeed to the world. And I think the West possibly is beginning to wake up to that after many years of trying to appease Iran, allowing Iran to develop nuclear weapons under the guise of a so-called nuclear deal, the JCPOA, by freeing up billions of dollars of frozen Iranian assets. And I think the West is maybe beginning to recognize that threat has to be addressed as well.
Does that appeasement lead to some degree of culpability on the part of the United States and the West, for allowing and enabling Iran to take money and to divert it to Hamas in the Gaza Strip and Hezbollah in southern Lebanon and its other proxies like the Houthis in Yemen, which have fired already multiple cruise and ballistic missiles and drones at Israeli territory from Yemen, and also to attack Israel from Syria and elsewhere? Where's the culpability and what level of responsibility do they have to now correct the bad policy of trying to appease Iran? I
think there is distinct culpability in the U.S. and its allies who stood beside it in appeasing Iran as they did over so many years. And excuse me, it's not just giving them money. It's not just giving them a free hand, letting them, for example, attack U.S. elements in Syria and Iraq without a real decisive response, encouraging them to think the U.S. is weak. It goes even beyond that. And you look at the withdrawal from Afghanistan 2 years ago, the catastrophic withdrawal from Afghanistan, which was basically waving a flag saying that we are incredibly weak and you can do what you want to us, the world's greatest superpower, which I think led directly also to the invasion of Ukraine by Putin. And it all comes into the equation when it comes to, the best way to prevent conflict is deterrence, and this is all failures of deterrence. And then another factor I think that comes into it is when President Biden distanced himself from the Israeli government, refused to have Netanyahu in the White House. Now that told a story to Iran as well. Well, maybe the US isn't going to stand with Israel in this situation. He miscalculated, but he had good grounds to calculate that. So all of these things, I think, have been factored in, and it does make our countries culpable for what happened. As to what the kind of consequences of that are, I don't think you'll ever see an admission of that. And the culpability goes even further to, look at all the money to build the terror tunnels, to get weapons, didn't just come from Iran and Qatar. There was a lot of Western aid money that went into that, as a lot of Western aid money goes into the West Bank, into Judea and Samaria, in funding terrorist activities there, paying the Palestinian Authority money for which they pay the salaries of Palestinian terrorists without really being controlled or restrained. And that, that adds to the whole picture of Western culpability in this conflict.
Also, in pressuring Israel to make land concessions to Palestine.
Absolutely.
Including the withdrawal from the Gaza Strip in 2005.
Absolutely. And we've seen the consequences of that. And while that's happening, we're still hearing, while we've seen the consequences of what was effectively a two-state solution, Israel and Gaza, two states in effect, and we've seen the consequences of that, we're still hearing from President Biden, from Britain's Prime Minister, from other world leaders, from the UN Secretary General, how important it is to have a two-state solution. I mean, if nothing else, this shows how impossible a two-state solution is now, and certainly at any time in the foreseeable future.
Right. Gaza was the pilot project for the independent Palestinian entity. And, coming back to this question of civilians, the question is, who produced who? Did Hamas produce the situation in Gaza, or did the Palestinian population, the Gazan society, produce Hamas? Like, where where is the chicken and the egg here? And people have argued that Hamas is not just a political or military organization, that it's an ideology, and as such that you cannot destroy it. Can the ideology of Hamas be destroyed at this point?
Well, I think the ideology that lies behind Hamas and lies behind Fatah as well, and let's not delude ourselves into thinking that the Palestinian Authority, Fatah, PLO, is some kind of peaceniks. They have the same objective as Hamas do. They have the objective of the elimination of Israel, the destruction of the Jewish state. They may not say it, at least in English, in quite those terms, and they may not necessarily have the same tactics for doing so, but they share the same objective. And all of this stems from decades and decades of anti-Israel, anti-Jewish propaganda and indoctrination, which started off in the first place, really. It goes back centuries, of course, in many ways, but the current impetus started off back in the 1960s in the Kremlin by the KGB, when they effectively created a Palestinian national movement to oppose Israel, but not with the necessary intention of opposing Israel, but of opposing US and UK influence in the region. So that's where it all started, and it's built up over so many years, and the indoctrination, the propaganda has developed and developed and developed to what it is today. And that all of that produced Hamas and has produced other versions of Palestinian terrorism. Whether you can destroy an ideology, well, after a successful war in 1945, the Nazi ideology was destroyed. You could argue it wasn't so firmly embedded in German society as the jihadist ideology is embedded in Palestinian society, but nevertheless, that ideology was pretty much totally annihilated. Same in Japan. Their militaristic ideology was eliminated over a period of years. So it's possible to eliminate an ideology, but to do that, you'd have to you can't. It's not going to happen overnight. It's going to take a long time, and you have to have the cooperation, I believe, of other Arab countries in order to do it.
And if it's not limited only to Hamas, but it also incorporates Fatah in Judea and Samaria, and also is included in this ideology is Hezbollah in the north. Can you erase the ideology if those two entities are allowed to remain in place?
I don't think there should be any question that, certainly in the case of Hezbollah, that it should be allowed to remain in place. I think Hezbollah was set up by Iran as a weapon against Israel, and it exists. It's basically a gun to Israel's head, a gun made up of about 150,000 missiles in Lebanon, thousands upon thousands of highly trained fighters who have gained battle experience supporting Assad in Syria, who receive massive financial support, arming, etc., from Iran. That cannot be allowed to stand. It simply can't now. I mean, it shouldn't really have been allowed to stand before, but now we've seen the 7th of October. The world has changed. That has changed the world, and that must mean that threat has to be eliminated. I've spoken to many people who live up in the very north of Israel, many of whom now are refugees in the central part of Israel, and their greatest fear, they're afraid of the rockets, of course. They're afraid of that 150,000 rockets, but they've had rockets before, maybe not in the volume they might get in the future. They've got shelters, they've got alarms, they've got the Iron Dome, they've got other anti-missile systems. What fears them, what they're mostly afraid of, is a kind of repetition of the 7th of October in their own homes. And so that threat's got to be eliminated. And now, I believe, now is the time to do that. And you're not, that doesn't get rid of the whole ideology, but it gets rid of the immediate threat that Israel faces.
We're already seeing a lot of activity on the northern border, as you mentioned. Israelis have been killed already. There's been dozens already of mortar attacks, anti-tank guided missiles shot at Israeli territory, drones penetrating just this morning some unidentified aircraft was shot down off the coast of Akko. At what point does Israel have the license or to go into southern Lebanon and to start doing what they're doing now in Gaza to Hezbollah and to dismantle Hezbollah as an entity?
I would say Israel has that license now as a result of what's happened on the border. And I would suggest that if all of that violence had occurred on the border, I don't know, 2 months ago, before 7th of October, when we hadn't got a war going on in Gaza, that the IDF would have gone in and dealt with that. The level of intensity would not have been acceptable to Israel, and it would have gone and dealt with that. And I suspect that one of the reasons why the IDF doesn't want to do that, isn't doing it now, is because it wants to get control of Gaza first and then deal with Hezbollah. But I think the scene is set, the stage is set to deal with it now.
Do you think there's international pressure against Israel not to expand the conflict into southern Lebanon?
I'm sure there is that pressure. And I think it would be probably a very, very unpopular move globally for Israel to make. But I appreciate that Israel has to listen to what the Americans in particular say and what others say, but particularly the Americans. But I think Israel now does need to deal with that situation irrespective of international pressure.
You've met Prime Minister Netanyahu, and obviously he's been in battle these last several years. There's been tremendous pressure on him, for even from before October 7th. There have been calls for him to accept responsibility for what happened on October 7th. What could you say about Netanyahu's conduct since this war started? How would you grade his handling of the war effort so far?
I would say, I've not been privy to any of the discussions and decisions, obviously, but from what I've seen of how the war has unfolded, I would give him an A+ for what's happened so far. I think the IDF has handled itself with great distinction, has achieved a great number of things. And I think he has also handled the diplomatic situation, the world situation, as well as could be expected, I would say. And you've got, you do have a situation where a very large number of civilian casualties have been unavoidably inflicted, yet still there is not that pressure from the world for Israel to stop fighting. And I think you have to give some tribute to the Prime Minister and some of his other ministers that they've managed to keep that support going.
If you were sitting before the war cabinet right now, what advice would you give them?
For one thing, I don't think they need my advice. I think they know what they're doing. There's some very, very capable people there. But I think what I believe should happen is that Israel should completely eliminate Hamas. Israel will then be left with a situation where it has to take immediate control of the Gaza Strip for I don't know how long, but no one else is going to take control of that territory, certainly in security terms, and the IDF will have to stay there. That's my perspective. If it's possible to get some other coalition partners to help with the management and reconstruction of Gaza, then that's fine, but security, it's going to be down to the IDF in Gaza for the foreseeable future. And I would say also deal with Hezbollah and deal with it as rapidly as possible.
And what do you think is the likelihood of this conflict expanding? Like, where do you think we are in terms of the length and phases of the war? Are we closer to the beginning or are we closer to the end?
It depends on what you call the war. If you call the war Gaza, then I would say we're probably approaching the end state of the suppression of Hamas. Maybe not the total elimination, but maybe the highest intensity of fighting in Gaza. But if you extend it to Lebanon, then we're probably at the beginning.
Richard, Kemp, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.